الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to another episode of Quran Circle 11, where we delve into the verses that talks about women in the Quran. And this is a try to see, and this is something that the ulama had mentioned before, and they even authored books about it when it comes to different subjects of the Quran, different way of approaching the verses of the Quran, the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you read the Quran from the beginning to the end, it's something that you cannot ever doubt that the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, both men and women, are addressed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to fulfill the purpose of their life, which is to establish the worship and the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No differences whatsoever when it comes to this, unlike those who humiliated women, those who oppressed women, things of that nature. And this is how human beings, when they turn away from the revelation from Allah, then they are upon darknesses after darkness. And that's why when we look into these rulings, the matters of belief, stories mentioned in the Quran, and verses to admonish our hearts, then this is how we benefit from it. And we are still in Surah Al-Baqarah, going through some of the verses that talks about some of the rulings that is related to women, one of which is the rulings of talaq or divorce, as we will hear it inshallah ta'ala in this episode. But before we listen to the recitation, I would like to introduce the reciters first, inshallah ta'ala. And we have Sheikh Abdul Khaliq Atiyah. Welcome to the program. Barakallahu feek. Jazakumullah khairan for coming. And Sheikh Ahmed Rajab. Allah yabarak feek. And Sheikh As'ad Al-Hawi.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa barakatuh. Barakallahu feekum. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us ikhlas and sincerity in our actions, and to make it sincerely for the sake of Allah. We'll go through inshallah ta'ala. The first part here is verse number 229 and 230 from Surah Al-Baqarah. So get a mushaf inshallah and open it and follow with the recitation. 229 and 230 from Surah Al-Baqarah. And Sheikh Abdul Khaliq, go ahead and recite for us inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. الطلاق مرتان فإمساك بمعروف أو تسريح بإحسان ولا يحل لكم أن تأخذوا مما آتيتموهن شيئا إلا أن يخافا ألا يقيما حدود الله فإن خفتم ألا يقيما حدود الله فلا جناح عليهما فيما افتدت به تلك حدود الله فلا تعتدوها ومن يتعد حدود الله فأولئك هم الظالمون فإن طلقها فلا تحل له من بعد حتى تنكح زوجا غيره فإن طلقها فلا جناح عليهما أن يتراجعا إن ظنا أن يقيما حدود الله وتلك حدود الله يبينها لقوم يعلمون.
MashaAllah. Jazakumullah khairan. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. As you see, these verses talks about that the talaq or divorce is only 2 times. So this is some of the rulings with regards to divorce, and this is to preserve and to protect the rights of women in times of jahiliyyah, times of ignorance. A man would divorce his wife multiple times, and before the waiting period ends, he would take her back, and then he would divorce her, and then take her back. So she becomes neither married nor she is divorced. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the limits of it only 2 times. And if the husband divorces his wife the 3rd time, then this is an irrevocable divorce. So this is basically what the verse are saying. And whether to keep them with ma'ruf, with goodness, something that is acceptable to be among the society, among the norm, or to let them go with goodness, and not to use the fact that you have authority when it comes to matters of divorce, that you would abuse the women. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade that to be from the men, to do that to the women. And also it's forbidden for the men to take anything that they gave to the women if they divorce, like the mahr, for example, the dowry and the like of this. And there is the rulings of khul', or if the woman, she's not able to live with her husband anymore, and she would make the matter in which that it comes from her, not from him, then she has to give him back the mahr. And again, these rulings are not to be applied once we hear something about it, but rather people have to refer to the qadi, they have to refer to the judge, they have to refer to the authorities, and not to make it upon themselves to deal with these matters like this, because it's a very serious matter. So this is also talks about this, where it shows there is a way out for the woman if she's not able to prove that she has grounds for divorce. For example, since Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave the men the authority to divorce, then for women it's called al-khul', where the contract is to be severed or to be terminated, but with the condition that she would give him back what he has given her with matters of the mahr. So these are rules, these are limits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made for the people, and He warned for those who transgress the limits, otherwise they're among the wrongdoers. And therefore, if he divorced her 3 times, then it's irrevocable. It's not permissible for them to go back again unless she marries someone else. And when she marries someone else, not with the intention that she go back to the previous husband, but rather she sincerely marry, and the marriage is to be done with the intention that it's forever. So if it happened that they get divorced after the waiting period is over, and if she wants to go back to the previous husband, then it's permissible under these conditions. But with the condition that they want to establish the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the religion of Allah, not to make mockery of the religion, or to not to observe the rulings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why it shows the importance of knowledge. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says these are the limits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made clear for people, for them to have the knowledge of it. So people need to have the knowledge of it, or as the people of knowledge, and not to be in haste just based on emotions they want to divorce or bring back or whatever, but rather it's based on ilm, based on knowledge, based on the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Afterwards, we'll go to the next 2 verses, inshallah ta'ala, verses 231 and verse 233. And Shaykh Ahmed, go ahead and recite for us, inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وإذا طلقتم النساء فبلغن أجلهن فأمسكوهن بمعروف أو سرحوهن بمعروف ولا تمسكوهن ضرارا لتعتدوا ومن يفعل ذلك فقد ظلم نفسه ولا تتخذوا آيات الله هزوا واذكروا نعمة الله عليكم وما أنزل عليكم من الكتاب والحكمة يعظكم به واتقوا الله واعلموا أن إن الله بكل شيء عليم وإذا طلقتم النساء فبلغن أجلهن فلا تعضلوهن أن ينكحن أزواجهن إذا تراضوا بينهم بالمعروف ذلك يوعظ به من كان منكم يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر ذلكم أزكى لكم وأطهر والله يعلم وأنتم لا تعلمون.
Barakallahu feek. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. So these verses with regards to the talaq or the divorce, as mentioned that some of the people at the times of Jahiliyyah ignorance, which is not the talaq, not the divorce of the Muslimin, but rather they would divorce their wife and right before their waiting period ends, he would take his wife back just to cause harm to her, to keep her hanging between whether she's married or divorced, she's in between. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade that, and that's why He said that once the waiting period ends, either you take them back with goodness or you leave them with goodness and you allow them to be free from such a tie that is not really stable, as it's mentioned here, by making mockery of the religion. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He forbade the men وَلَا تُمْسِكُهُنَّ ضِرَارًا لِتَعْتَدُوا. If you would hold them back, keep them back as a way to harm them, you're transgressing the limits. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's in the hearts. And whoever does this, he wronged himself. But then the verse says, وَلَا تَتَّخِذُوا آيَاتِ اللَّهِ هُزُوًا. Do not make mockery of the ayat and the verses and the rulings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How can that be? How can someone make mockery of the religion if people would do such an act? And one of which, as the ulama they mention in the tafsir, when people would make or say a divorce and they would say, I was playing. I was not really serious about it. That doesn't matter. If it says even if a person is joking, then also it becomes obligatory upon the person, because it's not permissible to make this subject, the divorce and marriage and so on, as a way of mockery, as a way of play. This is a very serious matter. And reminding them to remember the favors of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon them, and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed of the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, to admonish them and to fear Allah and to be obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to be watchful, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the all-knower of all things. And then the verse also afterwards, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that if you divorce the women and then their waiting period reaches and they passed the waiting period, which makes the divorce irrevocable, but if it's the first or the second one, it's not a final one. It's not a major irrevocable divorce, but a minor one, meaning if it's after the first or the second divorce and the waiting period is over, if this wife wants to go back again to her husband, they can, but with a brand new contract. Different than if he divorced her 3 times. They cannot go back together again unless she marries someone else. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbidding the guardians, the awliya of the women, to force her not to go back to her husband. And there was an incident at the time of the Prophet ﷺ where Ma'qil ibn Yasar radiallahu anhu, he got his daughter, his sister. She was married to one of the Muslimin, and he divorced her one time, and he did not take her back before the waiting period was over. So after the waiting period was over, they both wanted to go back to each other. So Ma'qil ibn Yasar, he said to him, Ya Luka, or something like this, Zawajtukaha, I made you marry her, and then you divorced her, I would never give her back to you again. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed this verse, and it shows how the companions radiallahu anhum, they would submit themselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Once the verse was revealed, فَلَا تَعْضُلُوهُنَّ أَن يَنْكِحْنَ أَزْوَاجَهُنَّ إِذَا تَرَاضَوْا بَيْنَهُمْ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. If they want to go back to one another, do not stop them from doing so, because again this bond is such an important one, and it's a very strong one between them. So once the verse was revealed, he says, I submit myself and I would allow them to return back with all honor, because this is the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala elevated their levels, complete submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, that this is how the hearts are admonished for those who believe in Allah and the last day. This is what purifies the hearts when they fulfill the commands of Allah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows and you do not know. So don't make mockery of the rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Be obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We'll continue inshallah ta'ala with right after that verses 233 and 234. 233 and 234. And Shaykh Asad, go ahead and recite for us inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم والوالدات يرضعن أولادهن حولين كاملين لمن أراد أن يتم الرضاعة وعلى المولود له رزقهن وكسوتهن بالمعروف لا تكلف نفس إلا وسعها لا تضار والدة بولدها ولا مولود له بولده وعلى الوارث مثل ذلك فإن أرادا فصالا عن تراض منهما وتشاور فلا جناح عليهما وإن أردتم أن تسترضعوا أولادكم فلا جناح عليكم إذا سلمتم ما آتيتم بالمعروف واتقوا الله واعلموا أن الله بما تعملون بصير والذين يتوفون منكم ويذرون أزواجا يتربصن بأنفسهن 4 أشهر وعشرا فإذا بلغن أجلهن فلا جناح عليكم فيما فعلن في أنفسهن بالمعروف والله بما تعملون خبير.
Inshallah, barakallahu feek. Jazakumullah khairan. So as you see, these verses with regards to the mothers and breastfeeding their children, and this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also honored every single human being and the rights of the children, and how that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave men what he didn't give women, and give women what he didn't give men, and one of which is the rights of the child to be taken care of and to be breastfed. And if the divorce happens and they have a child that is still breastfeeding, then the mother has the right, of course, to do so. And the husband or the ex-husband, then it's obligatory upon him to spend for his child, whether it's his matters of provisions, his clothing, with matters of what is known to the community or to the time that they are in. And this is the financial obligation upon the husband, and then if they divorce, upon him also, if he has children. And this is with matters of ma'ruf, with matters of goodness, to be determined according to the norm of the people. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not put ruling that is beyond one's capacity. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا تكلف نفس إلا وسعها. And that's why if it's judged between them, what's the capacity of the person, then that should be observed. And also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade any harm whatsoever. Especially when it comes to divorce, people, they which is evil for them to do so, they would try to revenge from one another. And oftentimes the children becomes the ones that would suffer a great deal as a result of this. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade them from this, whether harming a mother by taking away her children, that's not permissible for someone to do so, or harming her but by not spending, meaning from the husband or the previous husband to spend on his children and their provisions is something that is upon him. And if the husband died, for example, then it's upon the heirs to do so and to continue to do so because this is their responsibility. Even to the extent of which the decision to be made of how to wean or when to wean the child, especially when they are divorced. This is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said should be done with mutual consultation so that they don't punish one another because now they're divorced and the husband is spending from his money. What if he doesn't want to spend anymore and he's asking his ex-wife to stop breastfeeding the child, it's time to wean the child. Things of that nature, dispute can happen. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned for these matters is to consult with one another with regards to what's benefiting for the child, not for the greed within their own selves. And if the mother is not able to breastfeed, then someone else would breastfeed the child, then it's still upon the father of the child to spend on his children and to make sure that the woman that is breastfeeding, she's getting her wages as a result of that. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, after all of that is mentioned, and again there are more details to this, commanding the people to fear Allah. These are not just simple matters where you get angry at one another and you can get whatever you can get. No, this is rulings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He revealed verses of the Quran to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So commanding the people, وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهِ وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ اللَّهَ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ بَصِيرٌ. Fear Allah, be dutiful to Allah. And know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all seer of what you do. And then the verse talks about those who die, men, and they leave wives after them. And the iddah, the waiting period, is 4 months and 10 days. It's not 4 months only. It's not 3 months. It's not 5 months. It's 4 months and 10 days. This is revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in this waiting period after the husband dies, the rulings applies where the woman, she stays at home, observing the faithfulness as a result of the strong relationship. This relationship, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called it mithaqan ghalidhan. It's a heavy relationship. It's a heavy covenant. It's not just simple words to be said and that's it. Yes, it's with simple words. But then as a result of that, they are in a bond that is very strong. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed verses in the Quran about it. So when the husband dies, this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded the woman. It's not permissible for her to get married to someone else till the waiting period is over. And it's longer than the waiting period of a woman when she divorces her husband. And also to observe, to be away from adorning herself, to be away from leaving even the house of where her husband died while they are in a certain household, not to leave it unless there's a need for her to leave. You know, all of that to observe this faithfulness that she's supposed to observe as a result of the loss of the husband. And once they reach the limit, which is the 4 months and 10 days, then there's no harm for the woman then afterwards to get married if she wants to get married. And this is basically the explanation of what the verse says. There is no harm on them, there's no sin upon them in whatever they do with regards to their own selves when it comes to marriage. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that is well acquainted of what everybody does. And as the previous verse talked about, وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ اللَّهَ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ بَصِيرٌ, know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all seer of what you're doing. Then this verse is ended with, وَاللَّهُ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ خَبِيرٌ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with regards to what you do, He's the one that is well acquainted. More than just knowledge, knows what's in your hearts and what your intentions, and so that be watchful. Fulfill the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the love of Allah, with the fear of Allah, with the hope for the rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because these are not just something that is left for the people, those who have power, they would abuse their power, or those who are more eloquent in their speech, they're able to argue and to present their arguments in front of a judge, then they win. Sometimes this is what happens between a husband and a wife. The wife is not able to articulate herself or her arguments, or maybe the husband is not able to. So the judge would just make a judgment based on what's presented in front of him. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reminding both that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's in your hearts. and know what you're saying. And if you take something in this life that does not belong to you, or you don't have the right to it, then know that you wronged yourself, you committed injustice, and there is the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is waiting for the person as a result of that. Therefore, to fear Allah and to be obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As you see, this is all rulings that relates to women and marriage and divorces that needs to be observed. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect our households and to make them obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And before we end, I would like to thank the Mashaykh. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for coming with these beautiful recitation. Until next time, I leave you with the protection of Allah. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم ثم تلين جلودهم وقلوبهم إلى ذكر